She had no idea that the man who had just stopped that slap was the very person who could make anyone in that room disappear with nothing more than a nod. And she could never have imagined that the scratch now bleeding on his hand would become the cord that bound their two lives together forever. The Obsidian Casino stood in the heart of Las Vegas like a palace of sin and splendor. On that VIP party night, golden light blazed across the mirrored ceiling, making the entire grand hall shimmer as though it had been plated in solid gold. The scent of expensive Cuban cigars mingled with French perfume, and the laughter of the upper class echoed everywhere as if they were gods amusing themselves atop Olympus. In the middle of that shallow paradise, Blair Kensington moved like a ghost, 27 years old, with chestnut brown hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and eyes always lowered to the ground. She carried a heavy tray of champagne in her hands, her arms aching after 16 straight hours of work. Her last meal had been last night, and now the world had begun to sway at the edges of her vision, as though she were standing on the deck of a ship in the middle of a storm. 3 years earlier, she had been a Kensington heiress. 3 years later, she was invisible among the privileged crowd, a shadow no one cared enough to notice. She had learned the most expensive lesson of her life. If you want to survive, become transparent. Victor Ashford stood among his entourage like an emperor among servants, 55 years old, with a swollen belly straining beneath an expensive suit, his face flushed red with alcohol and self-satisfaction. The chairman of Ashford Holdings was loudly boasting about his latest deal, waving his cigar as though he were fencing with a sword, tossing out figures in the millions as if money were nothing more than scraps of paper. Blair tried to slip through the crowd, staying as far from Ashford's group as possible. But fate had other plans for that night. A drunken guest staggered past, his shoulder slamming hard into Blair without even noticing. The sudden collision threw her completely off balance. Her exhausted legs no longer had the strength to hold her upright. The champagne tray tilted, crystal flutes slid down like dominoes, and sparkling wine splashed straight across Victor Ashford's charcoal gray Armani suit. The entire grand hall seemed to freeze, as if someone had pressed pause. A deadly silence. The music was still playing, but no one could hear it anymore. Hundreds of eyes turned toward Blair as though she had just assassinated the president. Then came the roar that ripped through the air. Ashford spun around, his face shifting from red to a suffocated purple. His eyes bulged wide, the veins in his neck standing out in thick cords. He looked down at his drenched suit, then at Blair with the gaze of a man ready to crush an insect beneath his shoe. Ashford bellowed, his voice carrying through the hall, each word like a whip striking Blair across the face. "You miserable little bitch. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? It's worth 100 times more than your life." Blair stood with her head bowed, her hands trembling beside the empty tray. She bit down so hard on her lip she could taste blood. "Don't cry. Don't say anything. Don't look up." The last 3 years had taught her that silence was the only way to survive moments like this. But Ashford wasn't done. He stepped closer, his breath thick with the smell of whiskey as it blew across Blair's face. "Look at me. Are you deaf? Look at me when I'm talking to you." Blair didn't move. She knew that if she lifted her eyes, if he saw the look in them, everything would become far worse. Ashford ground his teeth together. His hand, covered in heavy gold rings, rose into the air, ready to strike. Blair shut her eyes, drawing into herself, waiting for the blow. But the slap never came. When she opened her eyes, a hand was gripping Ashford's wrist in midair. A broad hand, long fingers, blue veins visible beneath the skin. The hand of a man who didn't tremble even as he stopped a blow filled with rage. Jet Blackwood. No one saw him move. No one knew which direction he had come from. He was simply there, as if the darkness itself had gathered and taken the shape of a man. Taller than 6 feet 1 inch, with broad shoulders and a powerful frame beneath a black suit tailored so perfectly that not a single crease disturbed it. His black hair was brushed straight back, sharp as though drawn in ink. A faint scar ran along the left side of his jaw, not diminishing his beauty but only making his face more dangerous. But the most frightening thing was his eyes. The gray of the sky before a storm, of steel not yet heated, of fog hanging over a graveyard, cold enough to freeze the blood in the veins of anyone who dared look into them. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That gaze was already a sentence. His silence was more terrifying than any spoken threat. Ashford flinched, his face draining white as paper. He tried to yank his hand free, and his nails accidentally tore the skin on Jet's hand. Blood welled out, dark red against the pale skin of the man in black. Jet didn't flinch. He didn't look down at the wound. He simply released Ashford's wrist, slowly and deliberately, as though the man wasn't worth holding for even 1 second longer. Ashford stumbled back 2 steps, nearly falling. He stammered something that never formed into words, then spun around and hurried toward the door. His entourage rushed after him like a pack of terrified rats. Gradually, the hall began to breathe again. The music rose once more. People returned to their pleasures, whispering to each other about what had just happened. But Blair still stood there, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears like war drums. She looked up, and for the first time, she looked straight into the face of the man who had just saved her. Gray eyes met amber eyes, and in that moment, time seemed to hang suspended between the music and the whispers. Neither of them knew that their lives had just turned down a road from which there would be no return, a turning marked by the blood on the hand of a stranger, and by the gaze of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be protected. If you want to know what happens next between Blair and this mysterious man, please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Share this video with those you love who are drawn to deeply emotional stories like this one. Jet tilted his head toward the VIP corridor, a small gesture that wasn't quite an order, yet wasn't a request either. It was something suspended in between, an invitation that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Blair found herself following him before she had time to think, her feet moving as though they had a will of their own. The VIP room sat at the end of the hallway, completely sealed off from the chaos of the outside world. When the door closed behind them, every sound from the party vanished as though it had never existed. A black leather sofa stretched along the wall. Dim lighting spilled a faint golden glow, just enough for them to see one another. An abstract painting hung nearby, red and black twisted together as though someone had flung blood across a canvas, and then called it art. The room was cold and shadowed, reflecting with perfect accuracy the man who stood in its center. Jet sat down on the sofa, every movement slow and controlled. He looked at the wound on his hand with complete indifference, as though the blood seeping from it didn't belong to him, as though pain were someone else's concern. He didn't reach for a towel. He didn't call for anyone. He simply sat there, studying the scratch with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. Blair didn't wait for permission. 3 quick steps forward, and she dropped to her knees beside him, reaching for the apron she was wearing. The sound of fabric tearing cut through the silence as she ripped away a piece large enough to make a bandage. Her hands trembled from 16 hours of nonstop work, from the shock that had yet to fade, and from the thousands of nameless emotions twisting inside her chest. But when she began to wrap the wound, her movements were astonishingly precise, neat and practiced, as though she had done this 100 times before. Jet watched, not the injury being bandaged, but her. He watched those slender hands trembling but refusing to stop. He watched the way she bit her lip in concentration, the way she didn't cry or babble out frantic thanks the way most people would have. There were no tears, no pleading explanation, no excessive fear. None of the trembling submission an ordinary waitress would have shown in front of a man like him. There was only absolute focus on the task before her. His voice rose at last, low and rough, no louder than a murmur, yet in the stillness of that room it rang out like a bell. "What's your name?" Blair felt the question reverberate in her chest before her mind had time to process the words. She answered without looking up. "Blair Kensington." Jet's hand stilled for a single beat, only the briefest fraction of a second, but Blair noticed. She lifted her eyes and caught something passing through those gray eyes, quick as lightning. Recognition, calculation, interest. She couldn't tell, but she knew her name meant something to this man. He asked again, his tone still calm. "How long have you worked here?" 8 months. And before that? Blair tightened her grip on the strip of fabric in her hand, hesitated for 1 second, then answered shortly. "It doesn't matter." Jet didn't press. He didn't ask again, didn't probe the way other curious people would have, but those gray eyes continued to move over her, slowly and thoroughly. He noticed the way she spoke, her grammar polished in a way that didn't belong to someone raised in service work. He heard the words she chose, the restraint in her voice, the way she kept a safe distance, even while kneeling beside him. He read everything she didn't say. She was someone who had fallen, not someone born at the bottom. Blair tied the final knot, checked the bandage one last time, then rose to her feet and stepped back 2 paces. A safe distance, she spoke, her voice returning to the cool, professional restraint of a server. "It's done. You should let a doctor look at it. The scratch isn't deep, but it needs to be disinfected properly." Jet stood, and only then did Blair realize he was nearly a head taller than she was. He looked at the hand wrapped in a strip torn from her apron, then at her with an expression she couldn't read. He spoke in a tone that sounded like a declaration. "You don't belong here." It wasn't a question. It wasn't praise. It wasn't pity. It was simply a fact, stated plainly and directly, just as he had stopped Ashford's slap. Then he walked to the door without looking back, without another word, leaving Blair alone in the darkened room with her heart beating wildly and 1,000 questions turning in her mind. She stood there for a long time, staring at the door after it had closed. Then she lowered her eyes to her own hand, to those slender fingers still marked with the blood of a stranger. The blood had dried, turning dark brown against her pale skin. And in the silence of her own thoughts, one question echoed without an answer. Who was the man I just met? And why had the name Blair Kensington made those eyes flicker like that? "Someone asked me to give this to you." Maggie Chen, the night shift manager, appeared beside Blair the moment she stepped out of the VIP room. The 45-year-old woman, her black hair twisted into a tight bun, held out a black envelope, the kind of thick, expensive paper Blair hadn't touched since the days when she had still been Miss Kensington. Maggie's face was as unreadable as ever, yet there was something in her eyes, a fleeting look that felt like an unspoken warning. Blair took the envelope and felt its weight settle into her hand. "Mrs." Chen turned away without another word, her steps quick, as though she didn't want to be seen standing too close to Blair for too long. The employees' changing room sat at the end of the corridor, cramped and stifling with the smell of sweat mixed with cheap perfume. Blair sat down on an old plastic chair and turned the envelope over in her hands. There was no sender's name, no address, only the solid black of the paper and a silence that felt deliberate. She opened it. Inside there was only a business card, black as the envelope that had held it. Beneath the flickering fluorescent light overhead, the silver lettering glimmered like stars at night. No name, no logo, no title, only a 10-digit phone number printed in a slender, elegant typeface. And in the lower right corner, a line written by hand in black ink. "When you're ready." Blair looked at the slant of the handwriting, strong and decisive, like the man who had written it. She knew who the card had come from. The man with storm-gray eyes, the one who had stopped Ashford's slap without saying a word, Jet Blackwood. She slipped the card into her pocket and decided to forget it. She didn't need anyone to save her. The past 3 years had taught her the most expensive lesson of her life. Trust no one. Depend on no one. Never let anything or anyone have power over you. 3 years earlier, she had been Blair Kensington, the only daughter of Robert Kensington, the man who owned the most luxurious chain of boutique hotels on the east coast of America. She had graduated from Columbia University with highest honors in finance, courted by investment firms. Her future stretched before her like a Hollywood red carpet. She had a loving father, a gentle mother, a white mansion in the exclusive hills of Nevada, everything a 24-year-old woman could dream of. Then her father died, a car accident on the highway. That was what they said. The car lost control, crashed into the median, and burst into flames before anyone could get there in time. Robert Kensington's body had been burned so badly that it had to be identified through dental records. 3 days after the funeral, the white mansion burned in the middle of the night. Her mother, Miriam Kensington, was said to have died in that sea of flames. They never found a body, but the police concluded that she couldn't possibly have survived. Then the vultures came. Lawyers with thick files tucked under their arms, creditors with loans her father had never once mentioned, strangers holding transfer agreements Blair had never seen before, her father's signature resting neatly at the bottom of every page. The family fortune vanished even faster than the fire that had consumed the house. The hotel chain changed hands. The bank accounts were frozen. Blair Kensington, the Kensington heiress, was thrown into the street with nothing but empty hands and a heart shattered into a million pieces. She didn't know who stood behind it all. She didn't know why her life had collapsed so quickly, so perfectly, as though someone had planned it in advance. She only knew that she had woken up one morning with everything. By that evening, she had nothing. Blair shook her head and forced the memories back down into the deep place where they belonged. She looked at the black card one last time, read the handwritten line again, then tossed it into the drawer of her locker. She didn't need anyone to save her. She had survived for 3 years without anyone. She only had to keep going that way, living day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Blair stepped out through the back door of the Obsidian casino. The streets of Las Vegas still pulsed with neon light even though dawn was close, and the city that never slept carried on with its endless celebration while she dragged her exhausted feet toward the bus stop. Her stomach twisted with hunger, her head spun with fatigue, but she kept walking. Blair didn't know that in just a few days, her life would collapse all over again, and when it did, the black card lying in the locker drawer would be the only thing she had left in her hands. Your contract has been terminated. Effective immediately. The head of human resources at the Obsidian didn't look Blair in the eye when he spoke. He sat behind a gleaming oak desk, pushing the paper across its polished surface, as though he were shoving away a piece of trash that needed to be cleared out as quickly as possible. On the page were her name, the date, and the words termination of contract, printed in bold like a death sentence. Blair wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for this blow ever since the night champagne had spilled across Victor Ashford's suit. She just hadn't thought it would come this quickly. 3 days. Ashford had needed only 3 days to crush her completely. For a man with that kind of power, destroying the life of a waitress was probably as easy as the snap of a finger. She signed the paper without saying a word, rose from her chair, and walked out of the office. There was nothing to argue about. No one was going to stand up for her. One last time in the employees' changing room, Blair opened her locker and looked at what was inside. An old coat with worn shoulders, a few loose coins rolling in the corner, and the black card she had thrown in there 3 nights earlier. She stuffed everything into her bag and closed the locker for the last time. Maggie Chen was standing in the doorway when Blair stepped out. The night shift manager said nothing, only stood there with something in her eyes that looked almost like pity. But she didn't speak, not a word of comfort, not a word of farewell. In this world, everyone had to look after themselves. Blair understood that better than anyone. The following week was hell. Blair walked all over Las Vegas beneath the burning sun of the Nevada desert, knocking on the door of every restaurant, every hotel, every bar she could find. She filled out job applications until her hand ached, and smiled at every manager until the muscles in her face turned stiff. But the answer was always the same. We don't have a suitable opening at the moment. We'll contact you later. Could you leave your phone number? Hollow promises that both sides knew would never become reality. By the 5th day, Blair didn't need to ask any more questions to understand what was happening. Victor Ashford had ties to half of Las Vegas. The fine restaurants, the 5-star hotels, the glittering nightclubs, all of them were part of his web of power, or belonged to people who were afraid of him. No one dared hire someone who had offended the chairman of Ashford Holdings. No one wanted to invite disaster onto themselves. The rent was due on the 7th day. Blair's landlord, a middle-aged man with a beer belly and calculating eyes, knocked on her apartment door at 8 o'clock in the morning. You have 24 hours to move out, no exceptions. Blair didn't beg. She had run out of tears to cry and words to say long ago. She only nodded, closed the door, and began to pack. There wasn't much to take with her. A few old clothes, 1 pair of shoes that was still intact, an old phone with a cracked screen, and the black card resting in the pocket of her coat. Blair shoved it all into the leather handbag she had carried with her from New York 3 years earlier, the only thing left from her former life. She walked out of the apartment without looking back, without the slightest trace of longing. She was used to loss. This was only one more thing added to the long list of things she no longer had. That night, Blair sat on a stone bench in a park near downtown. Las Vegas flashed around her like a feverish dream she didn't belong in. Neon lights blazed in every color. Laughter echoed out of the casinos. Disco music spilled from the clubs, and luxury cars glided along the main boulevard. The city that never slept was celebrating, living, breathing, while she sat there alone with a handbag that held the last of everything she owned. Blair slipped her hand into her coat pocket, looking for the few coins she had left to buy a bottle of water. Her fingers touched the black card. She pulled it out and looked at the silver lettering shimmering beneath the streetlights. When you're ready. She hated this. Hated having to ask anyone for help. Hated the feeling of weakness, helplessness, dependence. Hated the thought of owing something to a strange man she knew nothing about except his eyes and the scar along his jaw. But she looked around, at the cold stone bench that would be her bed for the night, at the handbag that contained everything she had left. And she asked herself what other choice remained. Her hand trembling, she pressed each number on the phone. The cracked screen lit up in the darkness. The line rang. Once, twice. A low, rough voice came through on the other end, without a trace of surprise. "I've been waiting for this call longer than I expected." Blair didn't know what to say. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The voice continued, calm and cold. "Someone will come pick you up in 15 minutes. Stay where you are." The call ended before she had time to react. Blair sat there, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring up at the Las Vegas night sky with not a single star visible through the flood of artificial light. She had just stepped through a door without knowing where it led, and deep inside her, a small part she had thought had died long ago began to tremble with something that felt like hope. The black SUV pulled up to the curb exactly 15 minutes after the call. Not 1 second early, not 1 second late. The door opened, and a man stepped out into the darkness. 35 years old, dressed in a finely tailored gray suit, with black framed glasses covering half his face. On the surface, he looked like a successful attorney. But the way he moved, the way his eyes swept over the surroundings before settling on Blair, that was the gaze of a man long accustomed to violence. "Blair Kensington." She nodded, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag. "I'm Reed Thorne. Come with me." No further explanation, no unnecessary questions. Reed opened the back door of the vehicle, waited for her to get in, then shut it with a clean, precise click. The interior was wrapped in black leather, the scent of new hide mingling with the faint fragrance of sandalwood. Expensive. Everything about it breathed the language of expense. The car cut through the Vegas night, neon lights streaking across the windows like trails of colored meteors. Red, blue, gold, purple, all of it blurring into ribbons of light as the SUV picked up speed. Reed sat in the front passenger seat and didn't turn around to look at her. He spoke only enough for Blair to understand where she was being taken. Blackwood Tower, headquarters of Blackwood Corporation. Blair wasn't naive. 3 years in Las Vegas, even at the very bottom of society, had taught her enough. Everyone in this city knew about the Blackwood family. On paper, they owned half of Las Vegas, from casinos to hotels to the prime stretches of land along the Strip. And what they didn't own, they controlled by other means. Means that never appeared in ledgers. Means people only whispered about behind closed doors. The Mafia. She was entering the territory of the Mafia. Blackwood Tower rose before Blair like a monument to power and darkness. 50 stories of black glass standing over the Las Vegas skyline, reflecting the city lights like an enormous mirror. There was no garish sign, no blinking neon like the buildings around it, only the threatening silence of power that didn't need to prove itself. Reed led her through the main lobby, where the guards nodded in greeting without asking a single question. The private elevator stood at the end of the corridor, requiring a special keycard to activate it. The doors slid shut, and Blair felt her body go weightless as the cabin shot toward the highest floor. The doors opened. The penthouse spread out before her like an entirely different world. The space was vast, the ceiling soaring, yet so stripped down it felt almost cold. Black, gray, white, no other colors at all. No family photographs on the walls, no personal touches on the shelves, no plants, no flowers. Nothing to suggest that anyone truly lived there. Only expensive furniture arranged with perfect precision, as if for the pages of an architectural magazine, and floor-to-ceiling glass looking out over the glittering sweep of Las Vegas below, like a carpet of light. Jet Blackwood stood there with his back to her, gazing out at the city through the enormous pane of glass, still in that flawless black suit, without a single crease, still standing straight as a statue, broad-shouldered, spine rigid. His silhouette was etched against the night sky like the image of a king surveying his kingdom. "Sit." His voice came without his turning around, low and rough like stones rolling along the bottom of a stream. Blair sat on the black leather sofa, keeping her back straight, refusing to let herself sink into the softness of the cushions. She was in the territory of a predator. She couldn't afford to relax, couldn't afford to lose her guard for even a second. Jet turned and walked toward her with measured, controlled steps. Those eyes moved over her from head to toe, slow and deliberate, as if reading every thought in her mind. "I need a financial analyst, someone who can look at numbers and see what everyone else misses." He stopped in front of her, standing tall with both hands in the pockets of his trousers. You graduated from Columbia with a degree in finance, with honors. You worked with investment funds before falling into your current circumstances. You're suitable. Blair didn't blink, didn't let her surprise show at how thoroughly he knew her background. You could hire anyone with those qualifications. Why me? Jet looked at her for a long moment, his eyes never shifting. Because the others don't have a real reason to find the truth. They work for money. You're different. The words hung between them in the quiet room. Blair could feel that something lay hidden beneath them, as though Jet held a card she wasn't yet allowed to see. He knew something about her past, something she had told no one. Then he made the offer, his voice still even and without emotion. A salary 10 times higher than what she had earned serving at the Obsidian, a private apartment in this building, safe and protected. And most important of all, protection from Victor Ashford. In return, she would work for him. Blair looked straight into those eyes, searching for some sign of deception, of a trap, of anything at all that would tell her she should run immediately. But she found nothing there except cold composure and something faintly resembling curiosity. I accept, not because she trusted Jet Blackwood, but because she had nothing left to lose. No job, no home, no future, and if she had to choose between the freezing street and the warm den of a wolf, she would choose the wolf's den. Jet nodded, a small movement, as though he had known her answer before she ever opened her mouth. Reed will take you to the apartment. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we begin. Blair rose and moved toward the door, where Reed was already waiting. But just before she stepped into the elevator, she felt Jet's gaze still following her. Not directly, but through its reflection in the vast pane of glass. Like a ghost that never left, like a predator studying its newest prey. She didn't know what kind of bargain she had just stepped into, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Her life would never be the same again. 2 weeks passed. Blair was slowly growing used to her new life inside Blackwood Tower. Her private office was on the 48th floor, a spacious room with glass walls overlooking the Nevada desert, stretching all the way to the horizon. 3 computer screens stood in a row across her desk, numbers dancing endlessly from morning until night. Financial reports, balance sheets, cash flow statements for dozens of subsidiaries under the Blackwood Empire. The work was dry and demanded intense concentration, but Blair was good at this. This was what she had been trained to do, what she had once loved before life pushed her over the edge and into the abyss. The employees of Blackwood Corporation looked at her with curiosity they didn't even bother to hide. Every time she walked through the hallway, eyes turned toward her as though she were some creature from another world. Everyone knew she had been hired personally by the boss himself, brought straight into a senior position without passing through a single interview. Everyone whispered and speculated about the connection between her and Jet Blackwood. The waitress girl, they called her behind her back. The boss's new toy, the crueler tongues said, but no one dared ask her directly. No one dared come closer than the distance necessity required. Jet rarely appeared. Now and then Blair would catch a glimpse of him moving down a corridor, his stride quick and decisive, like a man who always had somewhere he needed to be. Sometimes, she saw him seated inside one of the glass conference rooms, surrounded by men in expensive suits, with faces as cold as marble. He never once looked toward her office, never nodded in greeting when he passed by, but Blair knew he was watching. Somehow, she could always feel his presence, as though an invisible thread connected them through the glass walls and the long corridors. On the 14th night, Blair was still in her office at 11 o'clock. She was analyzing a file on Blackwood Corporation's subsidiaries and business partners when one name flashed across the screen and made her hands freeze on the keyboard. Ashford Holdings. Her heart stopped for one beat, then began pounding wildly as though it meant to break through her ribs. She knew she shouldn't. This wasn't the task she had been assigned. This was a violation of the corporation's private records, but her hand had already clicked the file open before her mind could stop it. What she saw made the blood in her body go cold, as though liquid nitrogen had been poured into her veins. Real estate transfer contracts. Dozens of them, hundreds of pages. And on each contract, in the lower right corner, was the signature of Robert Kensington, her father. But Blair knew her father's handwriting. She had seen it for the first 22 years of her life, on the birthday cards he wrote out by hand each year, on the allowance checks he gave her while she was in college, on the will that had been read aloud on the bleak day of his funeral 3 years earlier. She knew the way he formed the letter R, the way he drew out the final stroke of Kensington, the way his pen always leaned slightly to the right. The signature on these contracts was not Robert Kensington's. Blair opened more files, comparing, analyzing, digging deeper into every document with the frantic obsession of someone who had just seen a ghost. Every contract, every signature, every notary stamp, all of it had been forged with exquisite care. The entire Kensington hotel chain, the 12 most luxurious boutique hotels on the East Coast that her father had spent a lifetime building, had all been stolen through these fraudulent papers. And the man behind it, the one who had profited from all of it, was none other than Victor Ashford. Blair's hands shook as she kept digging through the database. And then she saw the thing that made her forget how to breathe. A monthly wire transfer, regular as clockwork, from Ashford Holdings to an address called Serenity Hills. She searched the name on Google, her heart hammering like a war drum. The result came up: Serenity Hills, a high-end nursing and psychiatric care facility, located in a remote stretch of the Nevada outskirts. She opened the detailed file attached to the payment. Name of the patient receiving care: Miriam Kensington. Blair shot to her feet so fast that her office chair rolled backward and slammed into the wall with a crash. Miriam Kensington, her mother. The woman Blair had believed died in the fire 3 days after her father's funeral. The woman she had cried herself dry for beside an empty grave with no body in it. The woman she had forced herself to forget for 3 years so she could keep living. 3 years. 3 years of pain and loneliness. 3 years believing she was an orphan, with no one left in the world. 3 years forcing herself back up every time she fell because she thought there was no one left to lean on. And all that time, her mother had been alive, locked away in a psychiatric institution in the middle of the desolate desert. Alone, unknown to anyone. The office door opened without a knock. Jet Blackwood stepped inside, moving with the silence of a ghost. He leaned back against the desk across from her, his arms folded over his chest, those eyes sweeping across the computer screen displaying the Serenity Hills file, across Blair's pale face, across her hands that were shaking so hard she couldn't control them. "You found it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, calm and cold, as though he were commenting on the weather. Blair looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her voice trembling with the effort of holding back the rage boiling inside her chest. "You knew about this. You knew from the beginning, didn't you? From before you even hired me." Jet didn't answer at once. He looked at her for a long moment with eyes she still couldn't read, then spoke, his voice as calm as ever, terrifyingly calm. "Sit down, Blair. There's a great deal we need to discuss." "Why?" Blair didn't sit down as Jet had told her to. She stood facing him, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, her whole body trembling with the fury blazing inside her chest. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? Why did you let me find out like this? Alone, in the middle of the night, staring at a computer screen, and watching the whole world I once knew collapse all over again." Jet answered without flinching, his voice still as calm as if they were discussing a quarterly financial report. "Because you needed to see it for yourself. You needed your own reason to fight, not a reason I placed in your hand." Blair wanted to argue, wanted to shout in his face that she had deserved to know the truth from the start. But deep inside, the rational part of her understood. If Jet had told her everything on that first night, when she had stepped into his penthouse carrying the desperation of someone with nowhere left to turn, she would have thought it was a trap. She would have believed he had invented the story to control her. She wouldn't have trusted a single word. She had needed to turn every page with her own hands, to see every number with her own eyes, to confront the evidence herself so the truth could sink all the way into her bones. "What do you know? Tell me everything, right now." Jet looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how ready she truly was. Then he answered, directly, without evasion, without concealment. He knew about Robert Kensington's car crash 3 years earlier, and he knew it hadn't been an accident. The car had been tampered with beforehand, the brakes cut, every detail staged so perfectly that it would look like nothing more than a tragic highway mishap. He knew that Ashford had stolen the Kensington family fortune through forged contracts, and this hadn't even been the first time. He had swallowed up at least 5 other business families with the very same trick, and he knew that her mother, Miriam Kensington, hadn't died in the fire the way the police had concluded. She had been held inside Serenity Hills for the past 3 years, drugged into compliance, cut off from the outside world. Blair felt her knees threaten to give way, but she forced herself to remain standing. "Why do you care about what happened to my family? Who are you to know all of this? This was the real question. The question Blair needed answered before she could place her trust in anything this man said. Jet was silent for a moment, his eyes turning toward the glass wall where Las Vegas still flickered below in fields of colored light. Then he looked back at her, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower than before. Victor Ashford has been laundering money for my rivals, men who want to take the Blackwood family's territory on the West Coast. He's building a financial alliance against us, using dirty money to bribe officials, taking over businesses to create legitimate cover. Bringing Ashford down isn't only your goal. It's mine as well. Blair understood at once. This wasn't kindness without conditions. This wasn't a fairy tale about a knight rescuing a princess. This was mutual interest. Two different roads leading to the same destination. Jet needed Ashford destroyed because of a war for power in the underworld. Blair needed Ashford destroyed because her family deserved justice. They weren't allies because they liked one another. They were allies because they needed one another. But that didn't matter. The enemy of her enemy was her ally. In this war, she needed every bit of help she could get. What do I need to bring Ashford before the law? Jet laid out the terms of partnership, his voice shifting into the cool precision of a businessman negotiating a deal. This wasn't a request, wasn't a command, but an agreement between two equals. Blair would provide her deep financial expertise, her ability to analyze legal records, and the recklessness of someone with nothing left to lose. Jet would provide unlimited resources, intelligence from his network, and the protection necessary to make sure Ashford could never reach her again. Their shared objective was simple: gather enough evidence to expose Ashford's crimes, free Miriam Kensington from Serenity Hills, and reclaim justice for everything Blair's family had lost. Blair looked straight into those eyes, without blinking, without retreating. I have one condition. I do not work for you. I work with you, as an equal. There will be no ordering me around and expecting obedience. One corner of Jet's mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but closer to one than any expression Blair had ever seen on his cold, unreadable face. Fine. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need the empty rituals of politeness. Her eyes met his in silence, and that was contract enough, an unspoken oath, more binding than anything that could ever be signed on paper. Blair walked out of the office with a steadier step than the one she had brought in with her. For the first time in 3 years, she no longer felt like a helpless victim being shoved around by fate. This time, she was a warrior. And the battle had only just begun. The weeks that followed moved with a rhythm of unrelenting tension, analyzing files from early morning until late at night, mapping out every step in precise detail. Sitting through strategy meetings in sealed rooms with Reed and the men, Blair was slowly learning to trust. Blair and Jet spent hours together every day, bent over thick stacks of documents, arguing over tactics, dissecting Ashford's weaknesses. And in the middle of all that, she began to see another side of the man all of Las Vegas called the Ghost. Jet Blackwood wasn't as heartless as the rumors claimed. He was cold. That much couldn't be denied. He spoke so little that entire meetings could pass with him doing nothing more than sitting there in silence, those eyes taking everything in like a hawk watching prey. But he was also strangely fair, in a way Blair had never expected. He never lashed out at employees over small mistakes, never used power to feed his own ego. His orders were brief but clear, and he treated the people beneath him with a kind of cold respect rather than contempt. Reed Thorne, during one rare afternoon when the two of them were waiting for Jet to finish a call, told Blair a story. Once, one of the men in the organization was discovered beating his wife. Jet didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply called the man into his office, and when the man came back out, he no longer worked for Blackwood. No one knew exactly what had happened inside that room, but Reed said, in a tone heavy with meaning, "My boss has one simple rule. Anybody who lays a hand on a woman or a child signs his own death warrant." Blair began noticing the little details she had once overlooked. Jet never ate dinner on time, not because he had social plans or anyone to share a meal with, but simply because he forgot. He could work from morning until midnight without remembering that his body needed food. She began bringing meals into the conference room when they worked late, setting them down on the table without a word. He didn't say anything either, but he ate. And sometimes, when Blair glanced sideways, she caught his eyes resting on her for a brief moment before returning to the computer screen. Jet watched her too. Blair knew that. He saw the way she worked, as though her life depended on every line of data, every page of every contract. He saw the nights she stayed awake until dawn in her office when she thought no one noticed. He saw the dark circles growing deeper beneath her eyes, saw the faint tremor in her hand every morning when she lifted a cup of coffee because she hadn't slept enough. He knew all of it, even though he never said a word. One night, Blair was still in her office at 2 a.m, her eyes fixed on the computer screen where hundreds of lines of financial transactions were waiting to be analyzed. The door opened without a sound. Jet stepped in like a ghost, set a cup of hot coffee in front of her, then sat down in the chair across from her desk. They sat in silence for a long time. No voices, no sound except the quiet hum of the computer and the ticking of the clock on the wall. The desk lamp cast their shadows against the wall, 2 solitary figures inside a 50-story tower swallowed by darkness. "Can't sleep?" Blair asked, without lifting her eyes from the screen, her voice rough from having gone too long without speaking to anyone. "Nightmares," Jet answered shortly, as though it were the most ordinary answer in the world, as though everyone woke at 2 a.m. because of ghosts from the past. Blair didn't ask anything more, didn't press him to explain. But Jet spoke anyway, offering scattered fragments of a past he had never told anyone before. A father ruined by alcohol and violence, a man who ruled his household with his fists and with fear, a childhood without laughter, only shouting and the crash of things breaking. The faint scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, the one Blair had noticed from the first night she met him, that had come from the last time his father raised a hand against him. The last time, because after that Jet had been old enough, strong enough, ruthless enough to fight back. Blair looked at that scar in the dim light, then looked into Jet's eyes, and she understood. They were more alike than she had ever imagined. Both victims of powerful people, both driven over the edge by life, both forced to crawl out of the ashes on their own without help from anyone. The only difference was the path each of them had chosen in order to rise again. She had chosen education, hard work, faith in the system. He had chosen darkness, power, becoming the very thing people feared. Blair placed her hand on his shoulder, an instinctive gesture, unplanned, her hand moving before her mind had time to stop it. Jet went rigid for a fraction of a second, the muscle beneath the fabric of his suit tightening like a drawn wire, as though he wasn't used to being touched by someone who didn't mean violence. Then, slowly, his shoulder eased just a little, only a little, but enough for Blair to notice. "You should get some rest." His voice was lower than usual, rougher, as though something had caught in his throat. "We still have a lot to do tomorrow." Blair pulled her hand back and rose from her chair. She walked toward the door, paused for 1 second, then turned to look at him over her shoulder. "You should get some rest too." Jet didn't answer. He only sat there looking at her with those unreadable eyes. But when Blair stepped into the elevator and turned back for one last glance, she saw that the light in his office had gone out. That night, something changed between them. The invisible wall they had both built to protect themselves had begun to crack, delicate and fragile cracks, but impossible to deny. The black SUV came to a stop in front of the gates of Serenity Hills at 10 o'clock in the morning, its tires grinding over a layer of white gravel raked into flawless smoothness. Blair stepped out, her heels touching the ground with steady poise, even though her heart was pounding so hard it felt ready to break through her ribs. Her face revealed nothing. The light makeup and elegant gray suit made her look like a successful businesswoman paying a visit to a relative, not a daughter trembling because she was about to see the mother she had believed dead for the past 3 years. Serenity Hills looked more like a 5-star resort than a place where souls deemed mad were kept behind closed doors. The greenery had been clipped into perfect, symmetrical forms. Flowers bloomed in bright rows along the natural stone paths. Staff members dressed in spotless white uniforms offered polished smiles to every guest who passed. But Blair could feel the falseness in every detail, like expensive cosmetics painted across the face of a corpse, like the plastic smile on a doll's mouth. This place was too beautiful, too perfect, and that very perfection made her shiver. She entered under the pretense of being a niece visiting a patient, a folder of forged documents in her hand, prepared by Reed with painstaking attention, down to every last official stamp. While she was inside, Jet's technical team was working remotely, breaking into the camera system and extracting Miriam Kensington's full medical records. Every minute Blair spent in here gave them more time to gather evidence. The receptionist, a young woman whose smile was so wide it no longer looked natural, led Blair through a series of long, blindingly white corridors. The faint smell of disinfectant drifted through the air, mixed with the artificial lavender scent from the fragrance diffusers mounted along the walls. Fluorescent lights shone down in steady streams, leaving no shadows, no dark corners, as though the place feared anything that existed beyond control. They passed a common room where patients sat, scattered across oversized armchairs. Some stared out the window with empty eyes. Some muttered to themselves. Some simply sat motionless, like wax figures forgotten in a museum. Blair found herself wondering whether any of them were truly mentally ill, or whether they were all victims like her mother, locked away because they knew too much, because they had stood in the path of powerful men. Room 217. Blair stopped in front of the white painted wooden door, her hand resting on the cold metal handle, but she couldn't make herself turn it. 3 years. 3 years without seeing her mother, without hearing that warm voice, without feeling the embrace that used to gather her in whenever she was tired or frightened. 3 years of living with a grief that had seemed capable of tearing her heart to pieces, with a loneliness that had felt endless. She had cried beside an empty grave with no body in it. She had burned incense before a framed photograph every year on the anniversary of her mother's death. She had tried to learn how to keep living even though part of her soul had died with the woman she loved most. And all that time, her mother had been here, alone, imprisoned, waiting. Blair drew in a deep breath, forced the tears back down, and pushed the door open. Miriam Kensington was sitting in an armchair by the window, gazing out at the empty courtyard beyond with distant eyes. Her hair was whiter than Blair remembered, snow white now instead of the rich, warm brown it used to be. Her body was thinner, her shoulder bones rising sharply beneath the pale blue patient gown. Her face was lined with wrinkles that hadn't been there 3 years earlier, and her eyes were dulled, her gaze slow, the mark of sedatives etched into every expression. But when Miriam turned her head and saw who had entered the room, her eyes lit up like a flame being blown alive again from a bed of ashes. Blair? Her voice was rough and cracked, as though it had gone unused for too long, as though there had been no one to speak to for far too many days. But that one word, that single utterance of her daughter's name from those dry, chapped lips, shattered every wall Blair had built over the past 3 years. She ran to her mother, dropped to her knees beside the chair, and gathered that frail body into trembling arms. Tears spilled without restraint, soaking the shoulder of Miriam's hospital gown. Tears Blair had once believed had dried up long ago, because she had wept too much in those first raw months after the funeral. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you were alive. I didn't look for you. I didn't—" Miriam laid a thin hand on her daughter's head, stroking the brown hair gently the way she had when Blair was small, when her daughter cried after falling off her bicycle or being teased by other children at school. "I know, sweetheart. I know none of this was your fault." Through the storm of her sobbing, Blair felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder, drawing her closer. Miriam leaned to her daughter's ear, her voice dropping into a whisper so soft it was nearly nothing. Afraid the walls had ears, afraid the cameras had eyes. "Listen to me, Blair. I'm not crazy. They drug me so I'll look this way, so no one will believe anything I say. But I'm lucid, sweetheart. I've been lucid this whole time, for all 3 years." She gripped her daughter's hand so tightly her nails nearly bit into the skin. "And I know everything. I know what they did to your father." Blair lifted her head, eyes wide, tears still slipping down her cheeks. "What are you saying? Dad didn't die in a car accident?" Miriam shook her head slowly, her eyes full of the pain she had buried for 3 long years. "Ashford killed your father. He staged all of it. And I have proof. I have something that can put him in prison for the rest of his life." "Where is the video, Mom?" Blair gripped Miriam's hand tightly, forcing her trembling voice under control and swallowing back the tears still threatening to spill. She needed to focus. Emotion could come later. Right now, what mattered was information. Every second that passed in this room was another second in which she could be discovered. Another second her mother remained imprisoned in this living hell. Miriam began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper but clear in every detail, as if she had rehearsed this story 1,000 times in her mind over the past 3 years, waiting for the day someone would finally come to hear it. On the night before Robert Kensington's accident, he and Ashford had met in the study at the family estate. Ashford arrived close to midnight, his face flushed with alcohol and fury, demanding that Robert sign the transfer contracts he had refused to sign for months. The argument lasted nearly an hour, their shouting spilling into the hallway, the sound of things being thrown and shattered. Miriam had been too afraid to intervene. She had hidden behind the bedroom door and listened, paralyzed with fear. The security camera in the study recorded everything. The argument, Ashford's vicious threats, and later, after Robert had fallen asleep, footage of two strange men slipping into the garage and tampering with her husband's car. Robert never knew about the video because he believed the security system shut off after 11 o'clock every night, the way it always had. But Miriam knew. She was the one who had secretly changed the settings so the cameras would keep recording through the night, because she no longer trusted Ashford's increasingly frequent late-night visits. And right after her husband died, before Ashford had time to erase every trace, she watched that footage and copied it onto a USB drive. "I hid it in your father's safe, in the study at the estate." Miriam leaned close to her daughter's ear, her voice barely more than breath. "The safe is hidden behind the wall, behind the family portrait hanging there. The code is your date of birth, 8 digits, no dashes." She looked straight into Blair's eyes. Even clouded by medication, they still burned with fierce determination. "Ashford doesn't know that safe exists. He keeps the portrait there like a trophy, showing it off without ever realizing the key to his downfall is right behind it." Blair fixed every detail in her mind as if carving it into stone. The old family estate, her father's study, the family portrait, the safe hidden in the wall. The code was her birthday. "Mom, I'm going to get that video, and I'm coming back to take you out of here. I promise." Miriam clutched her daughter's hand so tightly her nails nearly broke the skin, her eyes full of fear and worry. "Be careful, Blair. Ashford isn't an ordinary man. He killed your father without blinking, and he locked me in here for 3 years without a trace of regret. He'll do the same to you if he realizes you're looking for the truth." Blair squeezed her mother's hand, her gaze hard and steady. "I'm not the weak girl I used to be, Mom, and I'm not alone." She rose to her feet and looked at her mother one last time before stepping out the door. Miriam remained there, her frail body beside the window, the morning sunlight casting her shadow across the wall like a sorrowful painting. But in those dulled eyes, dimmed by medication, Blair saw something beginning to burn again, something that had been gone for a very long time and was now returning. Hope. Outside the care facility, Reed was already waiting in the car, his eyes watching the front gate in the rearview mirror. "Any problems inside?" Blair climbed into the vehicle, shut the door, and stared straight ahead with a kind of determination Reed had never seen in her before. "I know exactly what we do next." Back at Blackwood Tower, Blair laid out the plan for Jet in the private conference room. Every detail, from the location of the safe to the access code, from the contents of the video to the way Ashford had staged the accident, Reed flipped through the intelligence reports his team had gathered, then cut in. "Next week, Ashford is hosting a charity gala at your family's old estate. Hundreds of guests, including politicians, business executives, and celebrities. Security will be occupied with managing the crowd outside. That's our best chance to get into the study." Jet looked at Blair, his jaw tightening, the muscle along his cheek twitching. "You're not going in alone." Blair didn't back down. She held his gray gaze without flinching. "You can't show up there. All of Las Vegas knows your face. Ashford will be suspicious immediately if he sees anyone connected to Blackwood at that party. Let me handle this." A tense silence stretched across the conference room. Reed looked from Blair to Jet and back again, not daring to say a word. At last, Jet nodded, slow and reluctant. A concession Blair knew couldn't have come easily to a man who was used to controlling everything. "You go inside, but I'll be right outside with my team. If anything happens, anything at all, you contact me immediately. No playing hero on your own, no stupid risks. Understood?" Blair nodded. Understood. The night of the charity gala had arrived. Blair stood before the mirror in her apartment at Blackwood Tower, staring at her own reflection. The simple black dress clung to her figure, elegant enough that no one would give her a second glance, yet plain enough to let her blend in with the catering staff. Her hair was pinned neatly up, her makeup light, nothing striking, nothing memorable. She needed to become invisible again, the way she had 3 years earlier, when she learned how to survive by turning herself into a ghost among the privileged crowd. A tiny earpiece had been fitted deep inside her ear canal, connected directly to Reed and the technical team. The phone in her coat pocket carried a GPS signal, so Jet could track every step she took. A counterfeit keycard rested inside her dress pocket, programmed to open most of the electronic locks in the estate. She was prepared, at least in the physical sense. As for her mind, she wasn't sure she was ready to face the old house. The Kensington estate blazed with light when the service car dropped her off a block away from the main gate. Blair stood there for a moment, looking at the house where she had grown up through the tall iron fence, the place where her father had taught her how to ride a bicycle for the first time on the lush green lawn behind the house, the place where her mother had planted rose bushes along the stone path and cared for them as tenderly as if they were children, the place where her family had once gathered around the fireplace every winter, her father telling stories, her mother pouring tea, and Blair laughing until her stomach hurt at his ridiculous jokes. Now that house belonged to the man who had stolen everything from her, the man who had killed her father, imprisoned her mother, and driven her over the edge into the abyss. Blair swallowed the pain, forced her face into perfect calm, and entered through the back service door. Inside the estate, everything was dazzling to the point of cruelty. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting warm golden light. Classical music drifted from the live orchestra in the corner of the grand hall. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with champagne and gourmet food. The upper crust of Las Vegas had gathered in full force, Armani suits and Chanel evening gowns turning in the rhythm of a waltz, their laughter echoing as though crime itself did not exist in this world. Victor Ashford stood in the center of the hall like a king, his face flushed from alcohol, one arm slung around the shoulders of a senator Blair recognized from the evening news, his mouth pouring out stories that glorified no one but himself. Blair slipped through the crowd with a tray of champagne in her hands, her head lowered, avoiding every eye. She knew every inch of this house as well as she knew the lines of her own palm. Every stair, every corridor, every hidden corner was carved into her memory from childhood. She set the tray down on a table when no one was looking, slipped out of the hall, and began climbing the back staircase meant for the staff. Second floor, end of the corridor, her father's old study. The electronic lock blinked red. Blair pulled out the card, swiped it through, her heart holding its breath. The light turned green. The door opened. Inside, everything had changed so much that Blair almost didn't recognize the room where her father used to work late into the night. Boxes of Cuban cigars were scattered across the desk. Bottles of expensive whiskey stood in rows inside a glass cabinet. Photographs of Ashford posing with celebrities and politicians covered the walls like an exhibition of arrogance. But the portrait was still there. The Kensington family portrait. 3 people. Her father, her mother, and Blair at 16, smiling in happiness inside a gilded wooden frame. Ashford had kept it as a twisted trophy, a silent mockery of the people he had crushed. Blair stepped toward the painting, her hand trembling faintly as she lifted it down from the wall. Behind it, just as her mother had said, was a cavity hidden perfectly inside the wall. A small safe sat inside, its metal surface icy cold beneath her fingers. She entered the code, her own birthday, 8 familiar digits. Click. The safe opened. Inside was a small black USB drive and several paper files yellowed with age. Blair slipped the USB inside her dress, close against her chest, her heart pounding like war drums. She had just turned to leave when the study door burst open. A large security guard stood there, his eyes widening in shock when he saw her in the middle of the room with the portrait tilted on the floor. "Hey, who are you? What the hell are you doing in here?" Blair didn't explain. There was no time, no reason. She ran. Shoving past the guard while he was still caught off balance, she tore down the corridor, down the back staircase, through the busy kitchen, where the chefs and serving staff were so occupied that no one had time to understand what was happening. The guard's shouting came after her, the crackle of radios, the pounding of heavy footsteps. She burst out the back door into the cold night air. The grounds were wide and dark, the carefully sculpted hedges now looking like silent ghosts standing in the darkness. She ran toward the back fence, where Reed had said there was a gap in the security system. Just as her hand touched the iron bars, a figure stepped out and blocked her path. Blair staggered back, her heart seeming to stop, her hands ready to defend herself even though she knew she didn't stand a chance. "Come with me. Right now." A familiar voice. Jet. He was here, inside the estate grounds, even though he had promised he would wait outside. Without time to think, Blair followed him through the darkness, through the gap in the fence Reed had marked, and into the black car parked in the shadows of the alley behind the estate. Jet drove like a man being chased by death itself, the engine roaring through the empty night. The silhouette of the estate fell away behind them, its lights fading in the rearview mirror like dreams dissolving into nothing. Blair sat in the passenger seat, breathing hard, her heart still hammering wildly inside her chest. She turned to look at Jet and saw his jaw locked tight, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, both hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles had gone white. "You said you'd wait outside." Jet didn't turn his head. He didn't look at her. He only kept driving at that terrifying speed. "I lied." No one said a word for the first 10 minutes. There was only the roar of the engine cutting through the empty night and the streetlights sliding past the windows like pale orange shooting stars. Las Vegas slowly fell away behind them, the high-rise buildings giving way to the dark desert stretching on both sides of the highway. Jet drove at a terrifying speed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his jaw clenched tight as though he were struggling to hold back something inside him that was on the verge of breaking loose. Blair sat in the passenger seat, her back pressed against the leather, both hands wrapped tightly around the tiny USB drive as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Because it was. The evidence that could condemn the man who had killed her father, free her mother, and reclaim justice for everything her family had lost. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to force her heart to slow even though adrenaline was still surging through her veins, sharpening every sense until it almost hurt. She could hear the second hand ticking on the clock in the dashboard. She could smell the leather of the seats mixed with the faint sandalwood scent drifting from Jet. "Why did you go inside?" Blair's voice broke the silence, rough from running and from everything she was trying not to feel. Jet kept his eyes straight ahead. He didn't turn. "You almost got caught. I could have handled it. You were running the wrong way." Jet cut her off, his voice suddenly sharp, like a blade slicing through the air. There were 3 guards waiting in that direction. Reed picked them up while scanning their radio signals. "If I hadn't stopped you when I did, you would have run straight into them." Blair fell silent. She hadn't known that. She had been too panicked to think, just running on instinct. And that instinct had nearly delivered her straight into the enemy's hands. The car suddenly slowed, then pulled over onto the shoulder of a deserted stretch of road, in the middle of a black desert, with not a single light except the cold stars overhead. Jet killed the engine, and the world dropped into absolute silence. Then he turned to look at her. "When Reed said there was a problem, I couldn't think at all. He stopped there, his jaw tightening as though he were forcing down words he was not used to saying. "I couldn't stay outside and wait while you were in there alone." Blair looked at him in the faint glow of distant roadside lights, the weak illumination sketching the sharp planes of Jet's face. The man all of Las Vegas feared, the man whispered about in rumors, the one who could make anyone disappear without blinking. The man even Victor Ashford trembled before. That man was sitting here now, letting the first visible crack appear in the steel wall he had built around himself for so many years. "Were you afraid I'd get caught? Or afraid of losing the evidence?" The question hung between them in the cramped silence of the car, heavy as an invisible stone. Jet looked at her for a long moment, and his eyes were no longer cold as steel. There was something else beneath the ice now, something warm and dangerous, something Blair had never seen in him before. "What do you think?" Blair did not answer with words. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over the one he still had clenched around the steering wheel, gently, carefully, as though she were afraid he might pull away, afraid that any sudden movement would shatter this fragile moment beyond repair. Jet didn't pull his hand back. He looked down at her hand resting over his, then lifted his gaze to her eyes. And in that moment, all the defenses both of them had carried seemed to fall away. No longer a mafia boss and the woman he had hired, no longer allies bound together by shared interests, only 2 people who had lived too long with loneliness, finding each other in the dark. They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, in the strange stillness of the Vegas night. Neither of them spoke of love, because it was still too early for words that heavy. Neither of them made promises, because both knew the war ahead was still long and filled with danger. But both of them felt it. Something had changed between them tonight. This was no longer only an alliance built on a common goal. This was something more, something deeper, something more dangerous, and something from which there could be no turning back. Jet started the car again, the engine roaring to life and shattering the silence. He pulled back onto the highway and kept driving toward Blackwood Tower, but for the rest of the drive, he never let go of her hand. The video flickered onto the large screen in the conference room at Blackwood Tower. The image was slightly blurred because of the old security camera, but it was clear enough to make out every detail. Robert Kensington stood face to face with Victor Ashford in the study at the family estate, the desk lamp throwing their shadows against the wall. The argument began with ordinary words, then rose into shouting. Ashford threw his hand up in threat, his face flushed dark with anger and alcohol. Robert shook his head with quiet resolve, refusing to sign the stack of papers Ashford slammed down on the desk. And then, when the screen shifted to the garage camera, two unfamiliar figures slipped in through the night, opened the hood of Robert's car, and worked inside it for nearly half an hour. Blair sat perfectly still, staring at her father's image on the screen, the man she had loved most in the world, alive and breathing in the footage of his final night. She swallowed her grief, forced the tears to stay in her eyes, refusing to let herself fall apart. Reed rewound the crucial section, zoomed in on the faces of the two strangers in the garage, then turned toward the group seated around the conference table. This is direct evidence that Ashford planned the murder of Robert Kensington. Combined with the forged financial records Blair uncovered and Miriam's medical records from Serenity Hills, we have sufficient grounds to prosecute him for money laundering, financial fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Blair drew in a slow breath, forcing her voice to remain steady. "What's the next step?" Jet answered in the same calm tone he might have used to discuss a business strategy, rather than the downfall of one of the most powerful men in Las Vegas. "Next week is the annual charity gala in New York, where the financial elite, politicians, and the most important media outlets in the country will all be gathered. Ashford will definitely be there to show off and strengthen his connections. We'll send all the evidence to the FBI before that night, and you'll appear at the gala, not as a waitress, but as a partner of Blackwood Corporation." 1 week of preparation, 7 days swept away in a storm of strategy meetings, secret calls with attorneys and FBI contacts, rehearsals for the confrontation waiting at the end of it all. And in the middle of that whirlwind, a familiar face appeared unexpectedly at Blackwood Tower. Maggie Chen, the night shift manager at the Obsidian, stepped out of the elevator with the same familiar walk and the sharp eyes Blair remembered perfectly. It turned out Maggie had been quietly following the news about Blair for months, worrying from a distance but never daring to interfere for fear of putting her in greater danger. Now that the plan had entered its final stage, she had come to help Blair prepare for the most important night of her life. "You don't need to turn into someone else," Maggie said it while running a brush gently through Blair's brown hair in the dressing room. "You just need to let the world see who you really are, the woman you've been hiding for the last 3 years." On the night before they left for New York, Blair stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her apartment at Blackwood Tower. The woman gazing back at her seemed like a complete stranger. Her chestnut brown hair had been styled into soft waves falling over her shoulders, no longer pinned back the way it had been when she worked as a server. Her eyes were no longer lowered to the floor to avoid the eyes of others. They looked straight ahead now, sharp, determined, with a slow burning fire inside them. The long black gown wrapped her body in elegant lines, tailored with quiet precision, never loud or gaudy, yet enough to make every head in the room turn when she crossed it. She didn't recognize herself. Or perhaps, for the first time, she finally did. "Are you ready?" Jet's voice came from the doorway. He stood there, one shoulder leaning against the frame, watching her through the mirror, and for the first time since Blair had met him, she saw something like astonishment pass across that usually unreadable face. Only for a moment, but long enough for her to notice. "I was born for this." Jet walked into the room and drew a simple silver bracelet from the inside pocket of his jacket, slender and elegant. "There's a GPS tracker inside, so I'll always know where you are." Blair looked at the bracelet, then lifted her eyes to him with the faintest smile. "You still don't trust me to take care of myself? I trust you." Jet fastened the bracelet around her wrist, his fingers brushing lightly across her skin and leaving behind a warmth that spread through her. "But I don't trust myself to sit still if I don't know you're safe." Blair felt the weight of the bracelet on her wrist, light, warm, like a reminder that she was no longer alone. For the first time in 3 long years, someone was standing behind her, ready to walk into the fire if she needed it. And tomorrow night, she would show Victor Ashford a truth he had never imagined. Robert Kensington's daughter had not died. She had only been waiting for the right moment to strike back. The Plaza Hotel, New York. The grand ballroom gleamed like a palace out of a fairy tale. Enormous crystal chandeliers hanging from the soaring ceiling, casting down thousands of glittering lights like stars fallen to earth. A red carpet stretched from the main entrance all the way to the stage at the far end of the room. Dom Perignon flowed like a river from towers of stacked crystal glasses. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with expensive perfume, creating the unmistakable fragrance of luxury and power. Hundreds of guests had gathered for the biggest charity gala of the year, politicians wearing polished, false smiles, CEOs in custom-tailored suits worth a fortune, film stars shimmering in diamonds from head to toe. This was the kind of place where decisions worth billions of dollars were whispered over a glass of wine, where the fate of millions was decided in the pressure of a handshake. Blair entered the ballroom with her arm linked through reed thorns, his role that night her official escort. Her long black gown clung to her body, elegant and alluring. Her chestnut brown hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. Her amber eyes were lightly enhanced, yet sharp enough to cut through every stare. Heads began to turn. Whispers spread through the crowd like ripples on water. Who is she? She came with someone from Blackwood Corporation. She's stunning. I've never seen her anywhere before. Blair was no longer invisible. She walked as though she had been born to belong in a room like this, as though red carpets and crystal chandeliers were the natural setting of her life, rather than something distant and untouchable. Her head was high, her eyes straight ahead, every step a declaration. She wasn't an intruder. She was someone returning to where she belonged. Victor Ashford stood among his powerful circle near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his face flushed with alcohol and self-satisfaction. He was laughing loudly about his latest deal, slapping a senator on the shoulder and spitting out numbers in the millions as though money were no more than scraps of paper. Then his eyes drifted idly through the crowd and landed on Blair. The smile froze on Ashford's mouth. The glass in his hand tipped, expensive whiskey spilling over the rim, nearly splashing onto the floor. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin gray and corpse-like. "No, that's not possible," he whispered, his voice trembling, his eyes wide as though he were seeing a ghost. Blair walked straight toward him, her steps steady and without hesitation. She stopped only a few paces away, close enough for him to see every line of her face, far enough to make her contempt unmistakable. The crowd around them began to notice. Conversations faded, curious whispers spread wider, like fire meeting wind. She looked straight into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her family, and her voice rang clearly through the sudden silence. "Blair Kensington, daughter of Robert Kensington, the man you said died in a car accident 3 years ago." She tilted her head slightly, the faintest cold smile touching her mouth. "And my mother, Miriam Kensington, the woman you kept imprisoned in a psychiatric care facility for the last 3 years. You do remember her, don't you?" Ashford went pale. He stammered, trying to recover his composure, but his own voice betrayed him, trembling with panic. "You? What kind of nonsense are you talking about? Who let you in here? Security, get this woman out of here right now." He turned his head wildly, searching for support, but no one moved. The powerful friends who had been laughing with him only moments earlier were already stepping back, their eyes full of suspicion and calculation. Then Jet Blackwood emerged from the crowd. He appeared beside Blair like a shadow taking shape out of thin air, tall and terrifying in a flawless black suit, his eyes sweeping over Ashford with open contempt. He didn't say a word. He didn't touch Blair. He simply stood there beside her. But his presence was a declaration that didn't need words. Anyone who dared lay a hand on her would be facing the full force of the Blackwood family. Ashford recognized Jet, and his face turned from pale to the color of ashes. "B. Blackwood? You work for him?" He stopped in the middle of the sentence, finally understanding everything. The scattered pieces in his mind had at last locked together, forming the complete picture of his own unavoidable collapse. And in the panic widening his eyes, Blair saw not only fear, but the shattering of an empire built on the blood and tears of innocent people. At that exact moment, the main doors of the ballroom flew open. The FBI entered like a storm. Black suits, faces cold and expressionless, footsteps hard and unstoppable. They headed straight for Ashford, indifferent to the whispers and stunned looks of New York's upper class. The lead agent, a middle-aged woman with her hair pinned neatly back and eyes sharp as knives, pulled out her FBI badge and held it up. "Victor Ashford, you are under arrest for money laundering, financial fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you." Cold steel handcuffs snapped around Victor Ashford's wrists before the eyes of hundreds from New York high society. The very people who had flattered him, shaken his hand, laughed at his jokes only moments before were now stepping away as though he carried the plague. Ashford shouted, cursed, and struggled against the agents. He screamed Blair's name. He screamed Jet's name. He He promised revenge. He swore he would crush them both. But no one cared. He was led out through the main doors, his shouting fading farther and farther away until it disappeared into the New York night. Blair stood there, watching the enemy of her family fall. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. There was only a strange emptiness spreading through her chest, as though something that had been crushing her for 3 years had finally been lifted away. And then, slowly, relief began to pour through her whole body. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of pain. 3 years of living like a ghost in the world. All of it ended in a matter of minutes. Jet stood beside her without saying a word. He simply placed one hand against her back, gentle but steady, warm and full of meaning. A quiet reminder that she was not alone, that he was here, that it was over. News of Victor Ashford's arrest exploded like a bomb across every television channel and social media platform. Billionaire real estate mogul arrested at charity gala on charges of money laundering and conspiracy to commit murder. The headline ran in a constant crawl across the news, accompanied by images of Ashford in handcuffs being led out of the Plaza Hotel, his face gray as ash, his mouth still twisted with useless shouted threats. Video from the gala went viral across the internet, drawing millions of views in just the first few hours. And the story of Blair Kensington, the victim's daughter, the woman who had quietly gathered evidence and exposed the crimes of the man who destroyed her family, became front-page news everywhere, from the New York Times to the Washington Post. Blair hated this fame with everything in her. She hated the endless interviews, the reporters calling from everywhere, sending emails, waiting outside the building where she lived. She hated the blinding flash of cameras every time she stepped outside, hated the curious questions about the painful past she had no desire to relive for anyone. But she endured it, because this was the only way her parents' story could be told truthfully, without being twisted or forgotten the way Ashford and his allies had once intended. Jet did not appear in public. The nature of his world would never allow that. No one in the press knew about his role in what had happened, and it needed to remain that way. But Blair knew he was always somewhere near, watching from a distance, through his network of people, making certain that no one could harm her in the middle of this media storm. The silver bracelet on her wrist was a constant reminder of his presence. Ashford was denied bail at his first preliminary hearing. The prosecutor argued that, with his vast financial resources and international connections, the risk of flight was far too high to allow his release. The judge agreed. Victor Ashford, the man who had once terrified all of Las Vegas, was taken to a federal detention facility to await trial. Inside a cold cell with gray concrete walls and fluorescent lights that never turned off, he was no longer a powerful kingmaker. He was only an overweight old man, trembling, facing for the first time in his life the consequences of the crimes he had committed over decades. The official preliminary trial took place 2 weeks later, in federal court in New York. Blair sat in the front row of the courtroom, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the defendant's stand. Ashford was led in wearing an orange prison uniform, his hands cuffed in front of him, his walk hunched and heavy, as though he had aged 20 years in 2 weeks. He did not dare look toward Blair. The eyes that had once been arrogant and contemptuous were now lowered to the floor, avoiding every gaze like those of a defeated man. The prosecutor laid out the evidence in a methodical, devastating order. The security footage showing the meeting on that fateful night and the moment Ashford's men tampered with Robert Kensington's car. The forged financial records proving he had stolen the Kensington family fortune through contracts bearing fake signatures. The medical files from Serenity Hills showing that Miriam Kensington had been held and sedated for 3 years without any valid diagnosis of mental illness. And the testimony of Miriam herself, now rescued and beginning to recover, recounting every detail of the night her husband was murdered. Each piece fell perfectly into place, forming a picture of Victor Ashford's crimes that could no longer be denied. There was no road left open for him. Ashford was charged with 15 separate counts, including conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, large-scale financial fraud, money laundering, unlawful imprisonment, and a long list of other crimes. The full trial would take place in a few months, but with the overwhelming body of evidence the prosecution had already assembled, the outcome was nearly certain. Victor Ashford would die in prison. Blair stepped out of the courthouse into the blinding New York sunlight after long days spent in the dim courtroom where natural light barely reached. Reporters swarmed around her like a hive of bees, microphones thrust toward her face, cameras flashing endlessly, dozens of voices shouting overlapping questions all at once. But Blair did not answer. She only kept walking, her eyes searching for one face in the chaos. Jet stood leaning against a black car parked across the street, his hands in the pockets of his trousers, his posture relaxed, as though he were only a passerby who had happened to stop and watch. But when their eyes met through the sea of people and camera lenses, Blair saw a small smile, almost impossible to detect, pass briefly over the lips that were usually so cold and unreadable. She moved through the crowd, crossed the street, and stopped beside him. The noise of the reporters began to fade when they realized she had no intention of answering a single question. "It's over," Blair spoke in a whisper, as though she still could not quite believe the words herself. Jet nodded, those eyes resting on her with a softness that did not often appear there. "It's over." They stood beside each other in silence, watching the flow of people and traffic through the streets of New York, without needing to say anything more. But both of them knew one truth with perfect clarity. This was only the end of one chapter in their lives. The next chapter had not yet been written, and this time, they would write it together. The gates of Serenity Hills opened beneath the morning sun of Nevada. Miriam Kensington stepped outside for the first time in 3 years, no longer a patient in the pale blue clothing of the care facility, but a free woman in the simple floral dress Blair had bought for her. Her steps were slow, yet steady, and her eyes narrowed against the harsh sunlight after so many months of seeing the world only through a small window. Blair stood waiting in the parking lot, her heart beating fast inside her chest. She had been waiting for this moment for weeks, ever since the FBI rescued her mother and placed her in a recovery program to clear the sedatives from her body. And now, as she watched her mother walk out into the light, Miriam looked completely different from the woman Blair had seen before in room 217. Her eyes were brighter now, no longer dulled by chemicals. Her steps were steadier, no longer unbalanced like those of a drunken woman. There was color in her skin again, no longer the gray cast of ashes. Miriam saw her daughter standing beside the black car, and she smiled. It was the first smile in 3 years, radiant as sunlight after a long winter, like the rose bushes she had once planted along the path leading to the family estate. They ran toward each other, meeting in the middle of the parking lot beneath the burning desert sun, and held each other as though one might disappear if the other let go. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need a single word. All the suffering of those 3 years apart, all the waiting and hopelessness, all the hope as fragile as thread, all of it was contained in that embrace. Blair brought her mother back to Blackwood Tower. Miriam sat in the car, watching Las Vegas slip past the windows with eyes that held both familiarity and distance. 3 years was long enough for a city to change, and she sat in silence, taking in the new buildings rising into the sky, the roads widened, the familiar signs that had vanished. When she stepped into the penthouse on the highest floor of Blackwood Tower, Miriam looked around the luxurious space with open surprise. The expensive furniture, the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the entire city, everything breathed power, but she didn't ask many questions. She understood that her daughter had lived through too many changes in the past 3 years. "Whose home is this, sweetheart?" "It belongs to a friend, Mom. Someone who has helped me a great deal through all of this." Just then, Jet stepped out from the hallway leading to the office. He stopped the moment he saw Miriam, and for the first time since Blair had known him, she saw him looking awkward. The man who could face the most dangerous enemies without blinking, who could command an entire underworld empire without the slightest tremor in his voice, was now standing in front of a small, gentle mother and had absolutely no idea what to do with his hands. He slipped them into his pockets, then pulled them out, then folded his arms across his chest, then let them fall again, like a teenage boy meeting his girlfriend's mother for the first time. Miriam studied him with the sharp eyes of a mother, taking in the faint scar along his jaw, the gray eyes cold as steel, the danger that seemed to radiate from every movement. Then she stepped forward and took his large hand into both of her small ones. "Thank you, son. Thank you for keeping my daughter safe through all of this." Jet stood there, his hand held tightly in hers, utterly motionless like a stone statue. Blair had to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud, because for the first time in her life she was seeing Jet Blackwood, the notorious mafia boss of the West Coast, completely lose control of a situation. That evening, they had dinner together in the penthouse living room. Blair, Miriam, Jet, and Reed. It wasn't a lavish feast with expensive champagne and elaborate food. Only simple dishes Blair had cooked herself from the recipes her mother used to make. Miriam spoke about the long months inside the care facility, about the way she had tried to stay lucid through the haze of sedatives, about the endless nights of missing her husband and worrying over her daughter. Blair told her own story, about the days she spent working as a server, about the fateful night she met Jet, about the fight to reclaim justice. And Jet? He only sat there and listened, his eyes drifting toward Blair now and then with something in them she still couldn't fully name. When Miriam went to rest in the guest room that had been prepared for her, Blair stood beside the wall of glass looking out over Las Vegas, glowing under the nightlights. Jet came to stand beside her, silent as always. "Your mother is a strong woman. I learned that from her." They stood in silence for a long while, their shoulders almost touching, watching the city that never slept glitter below. "Thank you. For everything." Blair said it softly, and for the first time she addressed him with the intimacy of someone no longer holding him at a distance. Jet didn't answer with words. He only stood there beside her, in one of the rare, peaceful moments either of them had ever known in lives so full of storms. "I'm leaving." Blair stood in Jet's office on the top floor of Blackwood Tower, her back straight, her voice calm even though her heart was breaking into pieces inside her chest. She had practiced saying those words all through the night before, repeating them to her reflection until her voice no longer shook. But now that she was here, standing in front of him, all that preparation felt meaningless. Jet was seated behind his desk, a file in his hand, his fingers stopping in midair the instant he heard her. He looked up, his face unreadable, those eyes fixed on her as though trying to see through the false calm she wore like armor. "Where will you go?" "Back to my family's old estate. The court has finished the transfer of the property. It belongs to the Kensington family again. I'm taking my mother back there. I'm going to reclaim the hotel chain and rebuild everything my father left behind." Silence stretched across the room. The ticking of the clock on the wall suddenly sounded unbearably loud. Blair went on, forcing her voice to remain steady even though every word felt like a blade dragging across her chest. "I have my own life now. I can't keep living in your penthouse, eating the food you provide, being protected by you forever like this. That isn't a life. That's dependence." Jet set the file down on the desk and rose slowly. He crossed to the wall of glass and stood there, looking out over Las Vegas as the lights of evening were beginning to come alive. It was the familiar posture he took when he didn't want to show emotion, his back turned toward her like an invisible wall. "This is your home, if you want it to be." That's exactly the problem. Blair drew in a deep breath, fighting the tremor spreading from her chest into her hands. "I want to stay. I want that more than anything, and that's exactly what terrifies me." Jet turned back, those eyes meeting hers with an intensity so powerful Blair nearly stepped back. "You saved me when I had nothing left in this world. You gave me weapons to fight with, gave me a roof when I was sleeping on a park bench, gave me hope again when I thought something inside me had died a long time ago." Her voice wavered slightly, no matter how hard she tried to keep it steady. "But I don't want to stay because I owe you. I don't want to be some burden you feel responsible for carrying. I don't want to wake up every morning wondering whether you keep me here because you want to, or because you feel sorry for the homeless girl I used to be. You think you're a burden to me? I don't know what I am to you." Blair looked straight into those eyes, refusing to back away. "Am I the ally who completed her mission? A charity project you happened to pick up? A guest you don't have the heart to turn away? What am I?" "All of it." Jet cut her off, his voice lower than usual, roughened as though every word had to force its way past thorns in his throat. "And none of the things you just said." They stood facing each other, only a few steps apart, yet it felt like an entire abyss lay between them. Blair waited for him to say more, waited for him to explain, waited for him to stop her with one word, one gesture, anything that would prove she had not been fooling herself about what she thought she had seen in his eyes. But Jet only turned away, looking back out the window as though the city beyond mattered more than the woman standing behind him. "If that's what you need, then go." His voice was calm, too calm, but Blair had spent months learning how to read this man, and she could hear the fracture buried beneath the ice. "You know where to find me. This door will always be open." Blair remained there for one long moment that felt like an entire century, still waiting for something. A word to stop her, a footstep turning back toward her, a hand reaching for hers. Anything. Nothing came. She turned away and walked toward the door. Every step felt as heavy as stone tied to her ankles, dragging her deeper into the abyss she had dug for herself. She didn't allow herself to look back, because she knew that if she did, she would never be able to leave. The elevator doors opened, then closed behind her. Blair stood alone in the narrow space of the elevator car, watching the floor numbers descend on the glowing panel, and at last, when no one could see her, the tears came. Not loudly, just silent drops sliding down her cheeks and falling to the polished floor beneath her. And in the quiet of that descent, she asked herself whether this was really the independence she had spent so long searching for, or whether it was only another form of punishment, another way of running from the thing she truly wanted. 2 weeks passed. Blair sat in her father's study at the old estate, stacks of paperwork rising across the desk like small mountains. Transfer contracts, financial reports, restructuring plans for the Kensington hotel chain. The assets were being restored step by step. The hotel group was being rebuilt from the ruins Ashford had left behind, and life was slowly returning to something that looked like normal. But Blair did not feel whole. She looked out the window toward the faraway horizon of the desert, knowing that somewhere beyond the dark expanse, the lights of Las Vegas and Jet were waiting. She checked her phone dozens of times a day, even though she knew no message would be waiting. She worked until she was exhausted, hoping the fatigue would fill the emptiness in her chest. But every night, when she lay in bed, she still saw those eyes in her dreams. Miriam stepped into the study, carrying a cup of hot tea. She set it down on the desk, then looked at her daughter with the eyes of a mother who understood everything without needing to ask. "You're not happy." It was not a question. It was a statement. Blair did not deny it, did not try to hide it the way she had for the past 2 weeks. Miriam pulled a chair beside her daughter and sat down, her warm hand resting on Blair's shoulder. "I see the way you look at your phone as if you're waiting for something. I see the way you look out the window toward the city every night before you go to sleep." Miriam took Blair's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "He matters to you, doesn't he, Jet?" Blair closed her eyes, trying to stop the tears rising behind them. "I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared of loving someone too much and losing them. I lost Dad. I thought I'd lost you for 3 years. I don't think I could survive losing one more person." Miriam tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, and her own eyes glistened with tears. "Listen to me, sweetheart. During those 3 years I was trapped inside that care facility. The only thing that kept me alive day after day was the hope of seeing you again. Love is not weakness, Blair. Love is the reason we fight, the reason we keep living no matter how hard life becomes." Blair opened her eyes and looked at her mother through a veil of tears. "Don't let fear steal the one thing that could truly make you happy. Don't repeat the mistake I almost made, which was not telling your father how deeply I loved him before it was too late." That night, Blair drove back to Las Vegas. All night long, through the black desert, with nothing but her headlights and the stars above to keep her company. She did not stop to rest. She did not hesitate. She did not turn back. Her heart beat faster with every mile that narrowed the distance between them. Blackwood Tower rose before her in the dawn, the 50-story tower catching the morning sun like a building plated in gold. Blair stepped into the lobby, passed through security without anyone stopping her because her keycard still worked. The elevator carried her to the top floor, each number rising like a countdown to destiny. The doors slid open. Jet stood beside the wall of glass, looking out at the city waking beneath the dawn, as if he had never left that place, as if he had been standing there for 2 weeks, waiting, though he did not know what he was waiting for. When he heard her footsteps on the marble floor, he turned. Gray eyes met amber eyes. Time seemed to stop. Neither of them spoke in the first moment. Blair walked toward him, each step slow but steady, until she stopped only 1 pace away. "I was wrong." Jet stood motionless, his face unreadable, but his eyes gave everything away. "Wrong about what?" "About thinking I needed to be alone in order to be strong." Blair drew in a deep breath, gathering every shred of courage she had left. "About running away instead of facing my own feelings. About being more afraid of love than I was of loneliness." Jet still stood there, his arms hanging at his sides, but Blair could see one of his hands trembling faintly, like a leaf before the wind. Slowly, she reached out and touched his hand, the one where the scar from the first night they met still remained. Fainter now than when it had first healed, but never completely gone. "You once said this scar made you feel alive." Blair lifted her eyes and looked straight into his gray ones. "And you make me feel worthy of being loved." Jet closed his eyes for 1 second, his jaw tightening as though he were fighting himself. Then he opened them again, and for the first time since Blair had known him, she saw him without a single wall left standing. "I love you." 3 simple words, but from Jet Blackwood, They carried the weight of a lifelong vow. I didn't know what love meant before I met you. I thought I would live alone in the dark forever. But now I know, and I don't want to lose this feeling. Blair cried then, tears sliding down her cheeks while the brightest smile she had ever worn bloomed across her face. I love you too. I've loved you since the night you stopped that slap for me in the casino. I was just too afraid to admit it, even to myself. Jet pulled her into his arms, holding her with fierce strength, as though he feared she might disappear if he let go for even a second. And Blair, for the first time in 3 long years, let herself completely surrender. She let go of fear, let go of her defenses, let go of the painful past. In the arms of the man she loved, she found peace. Victor Ashford was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with no possibility of parole or sentence reduction. He would die there, alone and forgotten, just as he had once intended for the Kensington family. Blair took control of the Kensington hotel chain, rebuilt it from the ruins, and expanded it into a powerful real estate empire in partnership with the legitimate businesses of Blackwood Corporation. Miriam lived with them in the penthouse at the top of Blackwood Tower, and the home that had once been cold and lonely was now filled with laughter and the warmth of family. Jet and Blair did not hold a grand wedding with hundreds of guests and overflowing flowers. They signed their marriage license right there in the office, with only Miriam, Reed, and Maggie Chen standing witness. Simple, private, and sincere, just like their love. The scar on Jet's hand faded with the years, but it never disappeared completely. And every time Blair touched it, she remembered that love sometimes begins with a wound and is healed by companionship. Thank you all for following the story The Scar of Fate all the way to the end. If you were moved, if your heart trembled along with Blair and Jet through this journey of tears and hope, please take a second to subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. How did you feel about this love story between darkness and light? Please leave a comment below. We would truly love to hear what is in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.